The invitation came on a Tuesday, tucked inside a cream envelope so heavy it felt like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. Nathan Hale stood at the cracked tile counter of his rental in Tacoma, turning it over twice before he opened it, the way you'd handle something you already suspected might hurt you. Behind him, the television murmured cartoons in the living room, where his 6-year-old son Eli sat cross-legged in his school uniform, spooning cereal with the careful concentration of a kid who didn't want to be late again. He didn't need to read the return address. He knew the handwriting on the front, that looping, confident cursive that used to write his name on napkins and grocery lists, and once the inside cover of a secondhand textbook she couldn't afford. Vanessa Caldwell. It had been 6 years. "Dad?" Eli asked, not looking up from his bowl. "You're doing the quiet thing." Nathan smiled the way he'd practiced smiling when things hurt, quick, easy, gone before anyone could examine it. "I'm okay, bud. Eat your breakfast." But his voice had that careful distance to it, like a man stepping around something he wasn't sure had finished healing. He slid his thumb under the flap and opened it. Heavy cardstock, gold foil lettering. "Vanessa Caldwell and Preston Webb request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration. Cliffside Manor, Carmel by the Sea, California." Beneath the formal type in Vanessa's own hand. "I hope life has been good to you, Nathan. It would mean a lot if you came." He read it twice. The second time, something in his chest tightened in a way he didn't entirely recognize. Not longing, not quite anger. Something closer to recognition. He knew Vanessa too well to believe this was simple. She had never done anything by accident, least of all kindness dressed up as an afterthought. 2,000 miles south, in a bridal suite that looked out over the Pacific, Vanessa sat in a silk robe while two bridesmaids passed a bottle of champagne between them and flipped through a leather guestbook. "You really think he's coming?" one of them asked, not looking up. "He's coming." Vanessa turned her engagement ring so the late sun caught it. "Men like Nathan always show up when they think there's still something to prove." The other bridesmaid smirked. "Didn't he end up doing like manual labor or something?" "Last I heard, single dad, picking up shifts wherever he could." Vanessa said it lightly, the way you'd mention the weather, but there was something underneath the lightness that didn't sound like happiness. It sounded old. It sounded like something she'd been carrying around for a long time and didn't know how to put down. 8 years before that morning, Nathan Hale had been the only person Vanessa ever imagined building a life with. They'd been 23 and 24, broke and exhausted, splitting a studio apartment in Sacramento that smelled like the laundromat downstairs. Vanessa had been grinding through her first year of law school, while Nathan worked anything that would have him. Warehouse shifts, weekend roofing jobs, 3 months delivering furniture for a guy who paid in cash and never quite enough. Nathan used to tuck notes into her casebooks before exams. He'd wait up past midnight with gas station coffee and a sandwich because he knew she forgot to eat when she was scared. When her financial aid fell through one semester and she didn't tell anyone, Nathan quietly sold the only thing of value he owned, his late father's fishing boat, the one thing the old man had left him, and never said a word about where the tuition money came from. Vanessa never knew. Not then. But ambition has a way of crowding a small apartment, and somewhere in their 3rd year together, Vanessa stopped looking at Nathan like a partner and started looking at him like a weight she was dragging behind her. Then Preston Webb arrived. Tailored suits, a corner office before 30, a way of ordering wine that made other men go quiet, and Vanessa began imagining a different version of her own future, one that didn't include falling asleep next to a man with grease under his fingernails. The night she left, rain had been coming down sideways against the window, and Vanessa stood by the door with 2 suitcases already packed. "I can't keep drowning next to you, Nathan," she'd said, and her voice hadn't even shaken. "Love isn't going to pay off my loans." Nathan hadn't argued. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd nodded once, picked up her bags himself, and carried them down 3 flights of stairs to the cab waiting outside, because some part of him believed that if he loved her, the last thing he gave her should be an easy exit. Vanessa mistook the silence for weakness. Most people did. The week of the wedding came fast. Cliffside Manor looked built for people who had never once worried about overdraft fees. White stone terraces hanging over the ocean, chandeliers the size of small cars, a guest list stitched together from senators and tech founders and people whose faces Nathan only recognized from magazine covers in dentist office waiting rooms. Vanessa moved through the chaos of final preparations in a fitted gown, photographers trailing her like she was the only thing in the room worth photographing. And still, every few minutes, her eyes drifted toward the entrance. "You're that invested in your ex showing up?" Preston asked, adjusting his cufflinks in the private lounge, amused in the way rich men are amused by things that don't actually threaten them. "I think closure's healthy," Vanessa said. Preston laughed. "Closure. Sure." He kissed her temple, distracted. If your sad broke ex actually does show, hope he enjoys the back of the room. He didn't know it had already been arranged. Table 41 beside the kitchen doors, where the waitstaff swung trays back and forth all night and the air smelled faintly of seared scallops. Every name at that table belonged to someone Preston considered forgettable. A second cousin, a divorced uncle, the wedding planner's assistant. Vanessa had approved the seating chart herself. She had pictured Nathan there, alone, watching her dance under string lights beside a man worth more than Nathan would make in 3 lifetimes, and the image had given her a satisfaction she didn't examine too closely. By the time the sun started sliding toward the water, the venue looked like something out of a film. String quartet near the cliffside, hundreds of roses, conversation drifting easily between stock tips and vacation homes. Then someone near the gate frowned. A black SUV rolled up the gravel drive. Then another behind it. Then a third, all matching, all moving with a kind of unhurried precision that made Valis step back instinctively. "Who is that?" someone murmured. 2 men stepped out of the lead vehicle first. Dark suits, no visible logos, earpieces tucked discreetly behind their ears. Not flashy security, the kind that scanned exits and roof lines out of habit, not performance. Conversations near the entrance thinned out and died. Preston frowned from across the terrace. Did somebody invite a senator? Nathan Hale stepped out of the last SUV, holding his son's hand. The silence that followed moved through the crowd almost like weather. Nathan wore a black suit with no logos, no obvious watch, nothing that screamed for attention. And somehow that was exactly what made every head turn. He didn't look like the man Vanessa remembered, the one who used to fall asleep upright at the kitchen table after a double shift. He moved slow and even, the way storms move before they hit. Eli walked beside him in a small navy blazer, eyes wide at the size of the chandeliers, his hand wrapped around 2 of his father's fingers. Nathan paused beside the cars while one of the men in dark suits leaned in and said something low. Nathan nodded once. The man stepped back. Something cold moved through Vanessa's chest, and it took her a second to recognize it wasn't attraction and it wasn't anger. It was the unfamiliar feeling of not being able to read him. "Who is he?" someone whispered nearby. "Wait, isn't that Vanessa's ex?" Preston forced a laugh that came out thinner than he wanted. "Okay, dramatic." Nathan and Eli crossed the lawn while the crowd parted around them. Not because Nathan demanded it, but because he never once looked around to see if anyone was watching. That, more than anything, unsettled people. "Dad," Eli whispered, tugging his sleeve. "Why is everybody looking at us?" Nathan glanced down, the faintest smile pulling at his mouth. "Because some people get nervous around quiet, bud." Vanessa felt her stomach drop hearing his voice again after 6 years, steady, low, nothing broken in it. An old classmate near the bar elbowed his friend. "No way. He actually came, heard he was working construction or something. Maybe the security guys are his Uber drivers." Someone joked, and a few people laughed low and careless. Nathan heard all of it and kept walking, and somehow that made the joke shrink instead of land. Vanessa stepped forward with practiced grace. "Nathan, you made it." He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "Congratulations, Vanessa. No edge to it, no bitterness." Somehow that disappointed her more than coldness would have. She'd wanted some flicker of pain, proof she still mattered enough to wound him, and instead he stood there like a man who'd survived things heavier than heartbreak. Her eyes dropped to Eli. "And this must be your son." Eli offered a polite, careful smile. "Hi, he's handsome," Vanessa said automatically. "He's the best thing that ever happened to me," Nathan said, and something twisted painfully behind Vanessa's ribs, because years ago he'd said that exact sentence about her. Preston stepped in with his hand extended, that practiced corporate warmth. "Preston Webb," Nathan shook it. Preston felt the calluses immediately, hands that had done real work, not boardroom hands, and noticed, almost against his will, the watch under Nathan's sleeve, understated, the kind that cost more than people who flaunted things ever understood. "Quite an entrance," Preston said, smiling carefully. "Long drive," Nathan answered. Before Preston could press further, the venue manager hurried over, visibly flustered. "Mr. Hale, we didn't realize you'd be attending in person, if you'd prefer the private terrace suite." "Table 41's fine," Nathan said gently. The manager blinked. "Sir, are you certain?" Preston and Vanessa exchanged a glance neither of them could quite explain. Nathan's expression didn't shift. "Table 41's fine," he repeated, and the manager nodded quickly and walked off looking rattled. "You know him?" Preston asked, trying to sound casual. "We've crossed paths." Nathan didn't elaborate, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any explanation could have. Dinner began, and so did the whispering. Someone claimed Nathan ran private military contracts overseas. Someone else swore he was connected to a federal agency. One investor cornered Preston near the bar. "You know who your fiancée invited tonight?" "An old boyfriend," Preston said, dismissive. That man's firm handles executive protection for half of Silicon Valley. Preston's smile faltered. What firm? Hale Defense Group. Never heard of it. The investor gave a short, uneasy laugh. That's kind of the point. Across the lawn, Nathan sat with Eli at the back table, exactly where Vanessa had planned to humiliate him, except the whole room kept drifting toward him anyway. Eli poked at his dessert, watching the string lights. "Daddy," he whispered, "are we important?" "No more than anybody else here," Nathan said. "Then why do those guys keep watching you?" Nathan glanced toward the two men stationed quietly at the edge of the tent. "Because sometimes keeping people safe means staying ready before you need to." Eli nodded slowly, the way kids do when they've decided an answer is good enough even if they don't fully understand it. Vanessa watched him across the lawn all night, and the worst part wasn't the money or the mystery or the rumors threading through the crowd. It was how calm he looked. He should have looked broken, sitting in the back of her wedding, and instead he looked like a man who'd already survived something far worse than being left. The string quartet softened as dinner wound down, but the tension around Nathan only thickened. Guests kept circling back to him under the excuse of small talk. Vanessa watched it happen again and again, and it gnawed at her more than she wanted to admit, because the entire point of the invitation had been simple. She'd wanted to feel like she'd won. Instead, the room respected a man she'd convinced herself she'd left behind for good reason, and that uncertainty crawled under her skin. Eli swung his legs under the table, staring up at the chandelier. "It looks like a castle." Nathan glanced up. "You know what castles don't have? What? Good waffles." Eli laughed loud enough that a few nearby guests turned, and Nathan laughed with him, quiet and real, and for the first time all night, Vanessa felt something she didn't expect. Jealousy, not of money, but of peace. Real peace. Preston never looked like that beside her. Preston looked like a man perpetually guarding his own reflection. Nathan looked like someone who'd already lost everything that didn't matter and kept everything that did. A business associate of Preston's wandered over with a whiskey in hand. "Mind if I sit?" Nathan nodded. Eli kept coloring on a folded napkin while the man leaned in. "Heard your firm handled the Lisbon extraction last spring." "Some of it," Nathan said, sipping his water. "Some of it. You pulled 4 executives out of a hostage situation. My team did their job." The man studied him. "You don't talk like a guy worth what you're worth." Eli looked up, matter of fact. "Daddy says people who need everyone to know they're rich usually aren't really anything else." The businessman laughed, startled. Nathan gave his son a look. "Buddy." "Sorry," Eli whispered, grinning. "Not sorry at all." Vanessa watched from across the lawn, arms folded, stomach tight. The Nathan she remembered used to wear his feelings right on the surface. Exhaustion, hope, hurt. She'd always known exactly where she stood with him. This version of him gave nothing away, and that absence scared her more than anger would have. Preston noticed her staring. "You good?" "Fine, he's putting on a show," Preston muttered. "Guys like that always need to prove something after they lose." Vanessa nodded, but for the first time, she didn't believe it. Nathan didn't look like a man trying to prove anything. If anything, he looked like a man trying to disappear, and the room wouldn't let him. Later, guests drifted toward the terrace, where the ocean wind cut through the string lights. Eli stood at the railing, watching the waves, Nathan's hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Vanessa found herself walking over before she'd decided to. "Your dress is really pretty," Eli said, looking up at her. "Thank you," Vanessa said, surprised into a real smile. "Daddy said you used to hate getting dressed up." Nathan exhaled through his nose, looking out at the water. "You told him about me," Vanessa said. "Not much." Nathan kept his eyes on the horizon. "He said you used to steal his hoodies and eat all his fries." Something in Vanessa's chest pulled tight. Memories she'd buried came back in pieces. Sitting on the floor of that studio apartment because they couldn't afford a couch, wearing his 2 big sweatshirts while she studied, laughing over burnt eggs at 2 in the morning after his shift ended. They'd had nothing, and somehow they'd been happier than she was now, surrounded by everything. "Eli," Nathan said gently, "go grab dessert. How many can I have? 1, 2? A small smile, worth a shot. Eli took off toward the tables, and Nathan watched until he was safely inside before turning back. Vanessa crossed her arms. "He's sweet. He saved my life," Nathan said simply. "You seem different. People usually do after 6 years." He finally looked at her directly, and the steadiness in his eyes unsettled her more than anger would have. "You expected me to come in here bitter, broken, so you'd feel better about leaving." "That's not fair," Vanessa said quietly, looking away. "Isn't it?" She opened her mouth and found nothing to say, because somewhere underneath the gold foil invitation and the careful seating chart, she already knew the answer. Nathan leaned against the railing, wind moving through his hair. "You know what's strange? I was never angry you left. How could you not be? Because I knew exactly what loving me looked like back then. A faint, tired smile. Memories crashed through Vanessa without permission. Nathan coming home covered in drywall dust. Nathan falling asleep in waiting room chairs during her panic attacks. Nathan skipping meals so she could afford her casebooks and never once mentioning it. She remembered one night specifically, crying over a tuition bill she couldn't cover, and the next morning finding an envelope with exactly the amount she needed. He'd told her it was overtime pay. Years later, she'd learned the truth from a mutual friend. He'd sold his father's boat. The last thing the man had left him. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Vanessa whispered. "Tell you what? How much it cost me?" Nathan shook his head slowly. "Because love isn't supposed to feel like a debt you have to pay back." The sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wedding noise drifted from inside, distant and unreal. "Why did you really come tonight?" Vanessa finally asked. Ely wanted to see the ocean, a small, almost embarrassed laugh. "And maybe part of me wanted to know if you were happy." Vanessa's throat closed before Preston appeared beside them, 2 champagne glasses in hand, his eyes locking onto Nathan immediately. "Everything okay out here?" "Fine," Vanessa said too quickly. Preston handed her a glass, studying Nathan with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I gotta say, I can't figure you out." "Most people don't need to," Nathan said. "See that? That whole mysterious thing." Preston leaned in slightly. "Guys who actually make it usually can't shut up about it. You act almost embarrassed." "Money impresses people who feel small," Nathan said. "Safety impresses me." Preston's smile thinned. "Safety." Nathan glanced toward the tent where Eli was laughing at the dessert table. "Everything I built for him." Vanessa followed his gaze and something settled painfully into her chest. Nathan had never chased power for its own sake. Everything about him had always circled back to protecting the people he loved. She'd just been too busy chasing the version of life she thought she wanted to notice. "You really expect us to believe all this security is necessary?" Preston asked, glancing toward the men stationed at the tent's edges. "Sometimes attention creates danger," Nathan said. "What, you some kind of spy now?" A faint, humorless smile. "No, then what are you?" For the first time all evening, something shifted behind Nathan's eyes. Not anger. Memory. Someone who learned the hard way what it costs when you can't protect the people you love. Preston looked confused. Vanessa wasn't, because suddenly she remembered the last few months before Nathan disappeared from her life completely. Strange phone calls he wouldn't explain, bruises he brushed off, nights he barely slept. At the time, she'd assumed it was just the stress of being broke. Standing here now, she wasn't sure anymore. "Daddy!" Eli came running, 2 cupcakes balanced carefully in his hands. "I negotiated." Nathan laughed. "Did you now?" Eli handed one over before noticing Vanessa. "Want some?" "Sure," Vanessa said, surprised. Eli split the cupcake in half without hesitation, handing her the bigger piece. "Daddy says sharing fixes bad days." Vanessa stared at the boy for a long second before taking it. Nathan watched the exchange with a softness that used to be reserved for her, protective, patient, asking nothing in return, and something inside her finally cracked. She'd spent 6 years convincing herself she'd outgrown him. Standing here now felt dangerously, achingly familiar. Her engagement ring suddenly felt heavier on her hand than it ever had. As the night wore on, Vanessa couldn't stop watching them. The way Nathan adjusted Eli's collar without thinking about it. The way Eli reached for his father's hand on instinct. The way Nathan listened to every word of his son's stories while powerful men hovered nearby waiting for a turn to talk to him. Preston checked his phone during conversations. Nathan remembered exactly how Eli liked his pancakes cut. Preston talked endlessly about expansion. Nathan talked about his son's soccer practice like it mattered more than any deal on the table. And worst of all, Nathan seemed to need nothing from any of them. No revenge, no vindication. Just his son, a cupcake, and the ocean. Vanessa understood with a clarity that felt almost violent, that Nathan hadn't been weak when she left him. He'd just loved her plainly in a world that mistook plain love for something small. By the final hour of the reception, the air at Cliffside Manor had curdled into something unsteady. The string quartet kept playing. Servers kept circling with champagne. But nobody was talking about the wedding anymore. They were talking about Nathan Hale. Investors who'd ignored him earlier now found excuses to drift toward his table one by one. Even Preston's own business partners looked uneasy whenever his name came up, and the more attention Nathan drew, the quieter he got, which somehow made it worse. Near the bar, Preston grabbed one of his investors by the sleeve. "Tell me what you actually know about this guy." The investor looked uncomfortable. "Not much. Nobody really does. That's the weird part. You said his firm does protection work. Hale Defense Group. Private intelligence, executive protection, cyber risk, government contract work. People in our world don't even say the name out loud casually." He pulled out his phone, opening a financial article behind a paywall. Preston's face slowly drained as he read. Hale Defense Group. Valuation $3.6 billion, operations in 9 countries, federal partnerships. This can't be the same guy, Preston muttered. Apparently it is. The investor glanced toward Nathan with open caution. You invited a ghost to your wedding, man. Guys like that don't show up in public unless there's a reason. Across the lawn, Vanessa stood frozen near the dance floor, memories flooding back without permission. Nathan carrying groceries in the rain because they couldn't afford a car. Nathan pretending he wasn't exhausted. Nathan telling her not to worry when the collection calls came. How had that man become this? And underneath that questions sat a darker one. What exactly had happened to him after Xiali sent? Before she could chase the thought further, movement at the entrance pulled the whole reception's attention. A woman walked in flanked by 2 assistants and 3 security personnel in dark suits, silver-haired, maybe in her late 50s, carrying herself like someone who'd never once had to raise her voice to be heard. That's Margaret Voss, someone whispered near the bar. No way. Why is she here? Margaret Voss was one of the most respected names in private security and intelligence consulting. A woman who'd made senators sweat in closed-door meetings, whom Preston himself had spent 2 years trying and failing to get a meeting with for one of his development projects. And now she was walking straight into his wedding, uninvited. Preston straightened his jacket and stepped forward with a practiced smile. Mrs. Voss, what a surprise, Preston Webb. Margaret barely glanced at him. I know who you are. She walked past him. The entire lawn watched in silence as she crossed directly to Nathan. He rose from his chair as she approached. Eli's face lit up. Miss Margaret! Margaret's expression softened instantly. There's my favorite negotiator. Daddy let me have 2 cupcakes, scandalous. She squeezed his shoulder gently before turning to Nathan, all business again. We need to talk. Something urgent? The board wants your decision tonight. She handed him a thin black folder. A few executives nearby overheard and went quiet. Nathan opened the folder, scanning the pages without expression. Preston stepped closer, jaw tight. What board? Margaret looked at him for the first time. The board acquiring Webb Coastal Holdings. The silence that followed felt physical. Excuse me? Preston said. Your investors approved the emergency acquisition this afternoon. That's not possible. Nathan closed the folder slowly. It's not impossible, he said quietly. Just bad timing. You're buying my company. No, Nathan said. I'm deciding whether it's worth saving. The whispers spread fast through the crowd. Vanessa stared at Nathan like she was seeing him for the first time, really seeing him. The man she'd once pitied now held the power to dissolve everything Preston had built with a signature. You planned this, Preston said, stepping closer, voice low and dangerous. I came because your fiancé invited me, Nathan said evenly. Preston turned on Vanessa. What is going on? She couldn't answer. Her mind was already unraveling under a much bigger realization. You think this is funny? Preston snapped. Nathan looked genuinely confused. No, I think it's sad. That landed harder than any insult could have. Eli tugged his father's sleeve. Daddy, people look scared. Nathan knelt beside him. Sometimes the truth makes people uncomfortable, Bud. Margaret looked at Nathan carefully. There's more. She handed him another page. He read it in silence, and for the first time all night, something shifted across his face. What is it? Vanessa asked before she could stop herself. Nathan looked at Preston. Federal agents executed warrants in New York 2 hours ago. Preston went completely still. Financial fraud, Margaret said, calm as ever. Offshore laundering, illegal acquisitions. The crowd erupted into whispers. Preston spun toward Nathan, color rising in his face. You did this. No, Nathan said quietly. You did. Vanessa's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear anything else. Preston looked cornered now, sweating, no longer the man who controlled every room he walked into. Nathan stood perfectly still beside his son, looking not triumphant, disappointed. Like part of him had hoped against everything that the night wouldn't end this way. Daddy, Eli whispered, sensing the shift in the air. It's okay, sweetheart, Nathan said, hand resting on his shoulder. Then the doors at the far end of the tent opened again, and this time the energy in the room changed completely. 4 agents in dark jackets walked in alongside federal officers in formal suits. Conversations died instantly. Cameras lowered. The quartet stopped mid-note. One agent walked straight toward Preston. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Vanessa's face went white. Nathaniel, Preston Webb, the lead agent said, holding up a document. We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy, money laundering, and fraudulent acquisition. The tent dissolved into chaos. Phones came out. Guests backed away from Preston like he'd caught something contagious. This is him, Preston shouted, pointing at Nathan. This is retaliation. The agent didn't even look his way. Sir, we've been investigating your organization for over a year. Preston turned wildly to Vanessa. Say something, but Vanessa couldn't move, because at that exact moment a colder realization swept through her. Nathan had known, not just tonight, for years. The strange calls, the bruises, the way he used to warn her gently to be careful around certain people at Preston's old networking events, back before any of this had a name. She'd thought he was paranoid. Now her stomach dropped through the floor. Nathan turned to her slowly as agents cuffed Preston a few feet away, the whole tent collapsing into noise around them. Somehow Vanessa only heard her own pulse. "You knew," she whispered, "didn't you?" Nathan was quiet for a long moment, then nodded once. Tears rose before she could stop them. All those years ago. He looked out toward the dark water. "I found out the people backing Preston's old firm were tied to laundering operations that went back years. Long before you ever met him. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were already on their radar," Nathan said, voice steady but quiet. "The second you started interning at that firm, your name got attached to people I didn't trust. The ground seemed to tilt under her, so you left." He finally looked directly at her, and the sadness in his eyes nearly broke her composure completely. "I disappeared because staying near you would have put you in danger." 6 years. 6 years she'd spent believing he left because he couldn't keep up, when the whole time he'd been carrying something far heavier than either of them realized alone, so she wouldn't have to. Nearby, Preston struggled against the agents while guests filmed every second on their phones. The wedding of the year had become a headline within minutes. But Vanessa barely registered any of it, because the only thing she could see clearly was Nathan, standing calm in the middle of the wreckage she'd once believed he deserved. Except he hadn't come to destroy anything. He'd come carrying a truth he'd spent years protecting her from, even after she'd stopped loving him for it. The story disappeared from headlines within a week, but it didn't disappear from Vanessa's life. Footage of federal agents walking Preston out of Cliffside Manor in handcuffs circulated everywhere. Financial news outlets picked apart his collapsed empire for days. Investors scrambled, lawsuits piled up. But the clip people kept replaying wasn't the arrest. It was Vanessa, frozen in her wedding dress, watching it all unfold beside the man she'd left behind years earlier. She left California before sunrise the next morning and didn't tell anyone where she was going. She ended up in a small sublet in Denver, borrowed from a college friend who didn't ask questions. No photographers, no galas, no image to maintain. Just quiet, and inside that quiet, the truth she could no longer outrun. Nathan hadn't failed her. He'd protected her from something she never even knew existed, and he'd done it without once making her feel guilty for not understanding. Even at the wedding, with every reason in the world to let her drown in her own mistake, he hadn't. He'd just let the truth surface on its own. That mercy hurt worse than anger ever could have. 2 months later, on a gray Saturday afternoon, Vanessa found herself outside a small recital hall near a lake on the outskirts of Tacoma, where Eli's piano teacher was hosting a student showcase. She'd almost turned the car around 3 times before she made it inside. Through the glass doors, she spotted Nathan first, sitting near the front row beside the piano teacher, calm and quiet, carrying that same grounded stillness that made every room around him feel smaller. Eli noticed her before his father did, eyes going wide before he broke into a grin and waved through the window. Nathan turned slowly. For a second, neither of them moved. "Hi," Vanessa said softly when she reached him. "Hi, Vanessa." No anger in it. Somehow that made everything harder. Eli ran over, breathless. "You came." "I hope that was okay. Dad said maybe you would." Vanessa glanced at Nathan, surprised. He looked down briefly. "He wanted to send you an invitation himself." "I'm playing 2 songs," Eli announced proudly. "I practiced forever." Nathan almost smiled, and Vanessa noticed how different he looked away from the chaos of that night. Simpler, more human. Just Nathan, the man she'd loved before fear and ambition convinced her she needed something else entirely. After the recital, Eli ran off toward the lake with a few other kids while Nathan and Vanessa stood under the awning, rain falling soft and steady beyond it. For a while, neither spoke. Then Vanessa said quietly, "I'm sorry." Nathan didn't answer right away. "Not because of what happened to Preston, not because of any of that." She swallowed hard. "I'm sorry because I stopped really seeing you long before I ever left. You were young," Nathan said. "No." Her voice cracked slightly. "I was selfish." He didn't argue, and somehow that honesty made the moment heavier than any reassurance could have. "Why didn't you ever hate me?" she finally asked. Nathan exhaled slowly, looking out toward the water. "Because loving somebody doesn't just switch off when they hurt you." Vanessa felt tears rise before she could stop them. "For a long time," he went on, "I used to think, if things had just been a little easier back then, maybe it would have gone differently." "Did you ever stop loving me?" she asked. He was quiet long enough that the answer existed before he said it out loud. "No," he admitted, "but loving someone and going back to who you used to be with, those aren't always the same thing." The sentence settled something gently and finally inside her. For the first time, she understood what it really meant to lose someone good. Not some dramatic, bitter ending, just the quiet truth that some people love you honestly once, and after you let them go, they don't belong to you again, no matter how much you wish they did. Eli came running back, waving a sheet of paper. "Dad, look!" Nathan crouched down as Eli held up a crayon drawing, 3 stick figures standing by the water, all of them holding hands. "I drew us at the beach," Eli said. "Because sad people should still get to be friends." Nathan laughed quietly under his breath while Vanessa wiped her face fast, hoping he hadn't noticed. "Did I say something wrong?" Eli asked, suddenly unsure. "No, baby," Vanessa said. "Not at all." Nathan took the drawing carefully and folded it. "I think it's beautiful." Eli beamed and ran back toward the lake. The quiet that settled between the two adults felt different this time, lighter, not fixed, but honest. "Do you think people can forgive each other?" Vanessa asked finally, "without getting the old life back?" Nathan watched his son laughing near the water, rain drifting soft across its surface. "I think forgiveness is just accepting that the love was real," he said, "even if life ended up going somewhere else." Vanessa nodded slowly, tears slipping down quietly as she watched Eli skip rocks at the edge of the lake. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, neither one of them felt trapped by what used to be.